The wind over the Yarmouk Valley did not care who would rule the world tomorrow. It swept across the dry grass, curled through the ravines, and carried dust into the eyes of men who believed history depended on them. On one side stood an empire that had ruled the eastern Mediterranean for centuries, armored, disciplined, confident in its own inevitability. On the other side stood an army that, only a generation earlier, had been a collection of desert tribes, poor in numbers but rich in conviction. In August of the year 636, near a river few in Constantinople could even locate on a map, the fate of the Byzantine East was about to be decided. Not by prophecy, not by miracle, but by exhaustion, leadership, terrain, and choices that could never be undone. The Battle of the Yarmouk was not meant to happen the way it did. From the Byzantine perspective, it was supposed to be a restoration of order, a crushing response to a rebellion that had grown far too bold. The empire of Heraclius had just survived one of the most devastating wars in its history against the Sasanian Persians. Jerusalem had been retaken, the true cross restored, and the empire, though battered, still believed itself to be the center of the civilized world. The Arab armies advancing north were seen as raiders, opportunists exploiting temporary weakness. Dangerous, yes, but ultimately manageable. Yet the desert had been changing faster than the empire realized. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, the newly unified Muslim community did not collapse as many outsiders expected. Instead, under the leadership of the first caliphs, it stabilized, reorganized, and then expanded. The Ridda Wars secured Arabia, and once the peninsula was unified, the energy of its warriors turned outward. To the north lay the Byzantine provinces of Syria and Palestine, rich lands, poorly defended, and politically exhausted after decades of war. Early Muslim successes shocked imperial commanders. Cities fell not because they were stormed, but because garrisons were thin and local populations were weary of imperial taxes and religious disputes. Damascus fell. Bosra fell. One by one, Byzantine strongholds either surrendered or were defeated in the field. By 635, it was clear that this was no longer a series of raids. It was a full-scale invasion. Emperor Heraclius understood the danger. From Antioch, he began assembling what he believed would be the decisive counterstroke. Troops were gathered from across the empire: Armenians, Greeks, Slavs, Christian Arabs, and veterans of the Persian Wars. The army was massive by the standards of the region. Contemporary sources exaggerate the numbers, but modern estimates suggest a force that significantly outnumbered the Muslims. More importantly, it represented the full authority of the empire. This was not a local defense. This was an imperial judgment. The Muslim commanders knew they could not fight separate Byzantine armies piecemeal forever. Khalid ibn al-Walid, already famous for his mobility and battlefield intuition, urged concentration. Muslim forces withdrew from several cities, abandoning short-term gains in order to avoid being trapped and destroyed separately. This retreat shocked local allies and confused Byzantine commanders, who interpreted it as weakness. It was not. The Muslims regrouped near the Yarmouk River, a rugged region of deep gorges and open plains near the modern border of Syria and Jordan. The terrain was dangerous. Steep ravines cut through the land, limiting retreat and punishing mistakes. Khalid understood this risk and embraced it. He believed that a decisive battle here could neutralize the enemy's numerical advantage. If the Byzantines were forced to fight on narrow fronts, if their heavy infantry could not maneuver freely, then discipline alone would not save them. Both armies arrived knowing this was not just another battle. For the Byzantines, defeat would mean the loss of Syria, one of the empire's richest provinces. For the Muslims, defeat could mean the collapse of the entire northern expansion and the destruction of their main field army. There would be no easy recovery for either side. The days before the battle were filled with tension, negotiations, and psychological warfare. Envoys moved between camps. The Byzantines offered terms that assumed superiority, submission, tribute, a return to the old order. The Muslim commanders rejected them calmly. According to tradition, one of the Muslim representatives explained their cause simply: they had come to bring people from servitude to men into servitude to God alone. To the Byzantines, this sounded like fanaticism. To the Muslim soldiers, it was purpose. When the fighting began, it did not explode all at once. It unfolded. The Byzantine plan relied on coordinated pressure across a wide front. Their infantry advanced methodically, supported by cavalry intended to exploit breakthroughs. The Muslim army was arranged into corps, each responsible for holding its ground. Khalid ibn al-Walid commanded a mobile cavalry reserve, the real weapon of the army, held back and unseen, waiting. On the first days, the Byzantines pushed hard. Their numbers told. Muslim units were forced back in places, and for a moment, it seemed the imperial army might simply grind its opponents down. Some Muslim lines wavered. Panic threatened to spread. Retreat, in that terrain, would have meant disaster. It was then that discipline of a different kind emerged. Women in the Muslim camp, according to multiple sources, stood behind the lines, urging the soldiers forward, blocking retreat, reminding them that there was nowhere left to go but victory or death. This was not a romantic gesture. It was a brutal reinforcement of resolve. The line held. Khalid watched. He did not commit his cavalry recklessly. He waited for patterns, for overextension, for fatigue. The Byzantine army, confident in its strength, continued pressing forward day after day, unaware that the longer the battle lasted, the weaker its advantages became. Supply lines stretched. Coordination between diverse units suffered. Commanders disagreed. The heat took its toll. The Yarmouk was becoming a test not of power, but of endurance. And the empire, despite its size, was beginning to tire. This was only the beginning. By the third day, the Battle of the Yarmouk had lost any illusion of order. What had begun as a structured confrontation between two armies was slowly degrading into something far more dangerous, a struggle of nerves, exhaustion, and fractured command. The Byzantine soldiers were still advancing, still pressing, but the confidence that had driven their first assaults was beginning to erode. Each push forward cost more than expected. Each gain was temporary. And each night, the Muslim lines were still there. The Byzantine command suffered from a problem the Muslim army did not: unity. This was an imperial army assembled in haste from many regions, bound by loyalty to the emperor rather than by shared experience. Language barriers complicated orders. Religious tensions, especially between Chalcedonian Greeks and Monophysite Armenians, quietly undermined cooperation. The Muslim army, by contrast, was smaller, more homogeneous, and led by commanders who knew one another well. They had marched, retreated, and regrouped together. They trusted each other. On the battlefield, that trust began to matter. Byzantine infantry continued to press the Muslim center, attempting to break through by sheer weight. Several times, Muslim units were forced back dangerously close to the camps. The pressure was immense. Shields splintered. Men fought in dust so thick it turned the sun pale. The sound of steel never fully stopped. But every time the line bent, it did not break. Khalid ibn al-Walid remained patient. He understood something his opponents did not. Time was now his ally. Each day the Byzantines failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough was a day they grew weaker. Their army was large, but it was not designed for prolonged combat in this terrain. Heavy armor drained strength. Cavalry found limited space to maneuver. The ravines behind the Muslim position made retreat impossible, but they also meant there was no room for panic. The men in the Muslim ranks fought with the knowledge that survival required cohesion. The turning point began not with a dramatic charge, but with a subtle shift. Khalid began to use his cavalry not as a blunt instrument, but as a scalpel. Small, fast-moving units struck exposed Byzantine flanks, then vanished before a full response could be organized. These were not attempts to break the line outright. They were designed to disrupt rhythm, to force enemy commanders to react rather than plan. Byzantine cavalry pursued, only to find themselves isolated, counterattacked, and forced back with losses. What made these maneuvers so effective was their coordination. Khalid's cavalry did not act independently. Each strike was timed to moments when Byzantine infantry was already engaged, already strained. The effect was cumulative. The Byzantines began to hesitate. Units waited for support that did not arrive. Momentum slowed. Then the wind changed. On one of the critical days of the battle, strong gusts blew dust directly into the faces of the Byzantine troops. It was a small thing, almost insignificant. But war is often decided by small things. Visibility dropped. Commands were shouted but not heard. Formations loosened. The Muslim forces, positioned with the wind at their backs, advanced into confusion. This was the moment Khalid had been waiting for. He committed his cavalry in force. What followed was not a single massive charge, but a series of coordinated strikes aimed at the Byzantine flanks and rear. Muslim cavalry swept around the edges of the battlefield, cutting off units from one another, attacking supply elements, and preventing reorganization. Byzantine cavalry attempted to respond, but they were outmatched in mobility and cohesion. The heavier imperial horsemen could not keep pace. Panic began to spread, not everywhere, but enough. Byzantine units that had fought bravely for days now found themselves attacked from unexpected directions. Orders became contradictory. Some commanders attempted to pull back to regroup, unaware that retreat routes were narrowing. The ravines that had once seemed like distant geographical features now loomed as deadly traps. The Muslim infantry, sensing the shift, pressed forward with renewed intensity. This was no longer a defensive struggle. It was an advance. The psychological transformation was immediate. Men who had been holding ground now believed they could take it. The Byzantines tried to stabilize the situation. Reserves were committed. Counterattacks were launched. But the battlefield was no longer under their control. Khalid's cavalry continued to exploit every weakness, striking where coordination failed, vanishing before being pinned down. The imperial army was being dismantled piece by piece. The final day of the battle was chaos. Byzantine units attempted a general withdrawal, hoping to escape the killing ground and regroup beyond the ravines. But withdrawal under pressure is the most dangerous maneuver in warfare. Discipline collapsed in places. Men ran. Horses stumbled. Units crowded into narrow passages, turning organized retreat into disaster. Thousands fell not to enemy blades, but to the terrain itself. The ravines of the Yarmouk became death traps. Soldiers pushed from behind, unable to stop, tumbled into the depths. Armor became a burden rather than protection. The river below ran choked with bodies. Those who survived the fall were often cut down attempting to climb out. By the time the fighting ended, the Byzantine army had ceased to exist as an effective force. Not annihilated to the last man, but shattered beyond recovery. Survivors fled north in small groups, carrying news that would be almost impossible to believe in Constantinople. An empire had lost Syria in a single week. Emperor Heraclius, upon receiving word of the defeat, is said to have left Antioch in silence. Whether or not the exact words attributed to him are authentic, the sentiment is clear. The eastern provinces were gone. Not temporarily occupied. Lost. The Battle of the Yarmouk was not just a military defeat. It was a strategic collapse. The Byzantines would never again mount a serious attempt to reclaim Syria. Within a few years, Palestine and Egypt would follow. The Mediterranean world was changing, and the center of gravity was shifting south and east. For the Muslim community, Yarmouk was validation. It confirmed that their expansion was not a fluke, not a series of lucky encounters, but the result of leadership, discipline, and adaptability. Khalid ibn al-Walid emerged as one of the greatest field commanders in history, not because he commanded the largest army, but because he understood how to turn limitations into weapons. Yet even in victory, the battlefield was silent. The dust settled. The wind returned to indifference. And the valley of the Yarmouk, scarred by days of fighting, became a memory written into history, not as a place where an empire died instantly, but where it began to realize it was no longer eternal. The Battle of the Yarmouk did not end when the last weapons fell silent. Its true consequences unfolded slowly, like a shadow stretching across decades. Empires rarely collapse in a single moment. They weaken, adapt, retreat, and only then understand what has been lost. For Byzantium, Yarmouk was that moment of irreversible understanding. The empire survived, but it was no longer the same empire. In purely military terms, the loss was catastrophic. The Eastern Field Army, painstakingly assembled after years of war with Persia, was gone. There were no reserves waiting behind it, no second line capable of restoring control over Syria. Recruitment in the region became impossible. Cities that had once supplied soldiers and taxes now lay beyond imperial reach. Even where garrisons remained, they were isolated, surrounded by a population that increasingly saw the new rulers not as invaders, but as a stable alternative. Heraclius understood this reality with brutal clarity. His decision not to attempt an immediate reconquest was not cowardice, it was realism. The empire's treasury was exhausted. Anatolia itself needed defense. The Balkans were unstable. Persia, though defeated, was not yet irrelevant. To continue fighting in Syria would have meant gambling the survival of the empire itself. So Byzantium withdrew, and in withdrawing, conceded the future. What made Yarmouk so decisive was not merely the loss of territory, but the loss of initiative. From this point onward, the Byzantines would fight defensively against a rapidly expanding Islamic world. The psychological balance had shifted. The empire that once dictated terms was now reacting, fortifying, negotiating, and retreating. The Muslim armies, by contrast, had proven that they could defeat one of the great powers of late antiquity in open battle, and do so decisively. This victory reshaped strategy across the region. Syria became a base, not a frontier. From Damascus, Muslim commanders could project power in every direction. Palestine followed quickly. Egypt, long dependent on Syria for defense, became vulnerable. Within a decade of Yarmouk, the eastern Mediterranean had been transformed. Trade routes shifted. Administrative languages changed. Religious and cultural landscapes evolved. The world of late Roman antiquity was giving way to something new. Yet it is important to understand what Yarmouk was not. It was not a victory won by numbers. Muslim forces were outnumbered. It was not a victory won by superior equipment. Byzantine armor and weaponry were, in many respects, more advanced. It was not even a victory won by fanaticism alone, though belief played its role. Yarmouk was won by command decisions, by flexibility, and by an understanding of warfare that emphasized movement over mass. Khalid ibn al-Walid's role cannot be overstated. His use of mobile cavalry as an operational tool, not merely a tactical one, was ahead of its time. He did not seek a single climactic charge. He sought control of space, of tempo, of enemy expectations. By forcing the Byzantines to fight a prolonged battle under unfavorable conditions, he dismantled their advantages one by one. Equally important was the Muslim command structure. Authority was clear. Coordination was consistent. Decisions were made quickly and adapted as conditions changed. In contrast, the Byzantine army, though brave and experienced, suffered from divided leadership and rigid planning. Once the original plan failed, there was no effective alternative. The terrain of Yarmouk amplified these differences. What should have been a neutral factor became a weapon. Ravines punished disorder. Narrow approaches limited maneuver. The land itself favored the army that could adapt faster, and punished the one that relied on control it no longer possessed.